The smell hit Vorath first. Every species had its own chemical signature, its own olfactory fingerprint that told a trained observer everything they needed to know before a single word was exchanged. The Keth diplomatic station smelled of mineral dust and recycled ozone. The Myriad research colony smelled of enzymatic compounds and quiet ambition. But this place, this human medical facility, operating under artificial lighting at a point in the planetary rotation they called 11 in the evening, smelled of something Vorath had no reference for. Antiseptic chemicals layered over biological waste, layered over something warm and alive and faintly sweet that his scent organs could not categorize. He spent the first 4 minutes of his observation shift simply standing in the corridor outside the central triage area, his secondary breathing membrane fluttering in slow, involuntary pulses, trying to process it. His official designation here was Medical Exchange Observer, Keth Biological Sciences Division, 3rd Tier. His actual function was to watch, record, report back to the Council on how human medical infrastructure performed under stress conditions, because the Galactic Cooperative had been arguing for 2 full cycles about whether to classify humanity as a Category 2 civilization or hold them at Category 1, and the medical division wanted data, real data, not the sanitized reports the humans submitted, carefully translated and stripped of anything that might make them look chaotic or inefficient or alarmingly prone to improvisation. Vorath was here to see the improvisation firsthand. He had been assigned to the overnight shift, what the facility's staff called the night shift, at a regional trauma center in a mid-sized human city. His cover was simple: visiting medical researcher, observational only, cleared by the hospital administration, a small translation device clipped to his collar. His Keth physiology was humanoid enough to pass without significant alarm. His 4-fingered hands covered in thin observer's gloves, his facial structure close enough to the human range that most people glanced at him and looked away without registering anything specific. This was by design. Keth observers were selected for their ability to disappear into a room. He had been told to shadow a single nurse for the duration of the shift. Her name was Della. Vorath read the designation on her identification tag at 11:04 p.m. as she walked past him without looking up from the tablet in her hands, already moving with the particular velocity of someone who had places to be and no patience for the physics of hallways. Registered nurse, emergency department, 13 years of service. The administrator who had briefed Vorath had described her as experienced, which Vorath would later understand was the human word for someone who had survived enough disasters to stop being surprised by new ones. She was of medium height by human standards, with close-cropped hair and the kind of eyes that did several things at once: cataloging, calculating, dismissing, filing. She wore plain dark scrubs and carried nothing on her body that was not immediately functional. No decoration, no excess. A human optimized, Vorath thought, for a specific environment. Like a pressure-adapted creature evolved for deep water. Not beautiful by surface standards, but perfectly, ruthlessly suited to its conditions. She did not introduce herself to him. She glanced at his observer badge, said, "You stay out of the way, and you don't touch anything," and walked away. Vorath noted that she had also not asked his name, his species, or his purpose. Either she already knew, or she did not care, or both. He followed at a respectful 3-pace distance and began his observations. The emergency department at 11:07 p.m. was not, by his initial assessment, chaotic. It was full. Every bay occupied, the waiting area loud and unquiet, the central nursing station buried under screens and sounds and the constant soft percussion of monitoring equipment. But the staff moved through it the way Keth pilots move through a debris field. Not panicked, not reckless, but with that particular focused economy of motion that comes from having done this exact thing many times before and knowing precisely where the edges were. Vorath had studied human medical facilities extensively in preparation for this assignment. He knew the terminology. He knew the triage categories, the pharmacological protocols, the procedural hierarchies. He believed he understood the system. He did not yet understand Della. Her first patient of the shift was a male human, middle-aged, complaining of chest tightening that he was trying to describe as not a big deal, while his face performed a very different narrative. Della listened to him speak for approximately 11 seconds, then placed 2 fingers against the inside of his wrist in a gesture Vorath recognized as pulse assessment. She did this while simultaneously reading his intake paperwork, flagging something on her tablet, and asking him a question about whether the pain moved into his left arm, in a tone of voice so casual it took Vorath a moment to understand she was screening for cardiac events. The man said it did, a little. He said it the way humans often said alarming things, hedged, apologetic, as if the severity of their own symptoms was an imposition. Della's expression did not change. She told him they were going to get him into a bay and run some tests, said it the way one might discuss something entirely unremarkable. And then, as she turned away from him, Vorath caught, just for a fraction of a second, the shift in her jaw. A tightening, not alarm, something more controlled than alarm. The adjustment of a person mentally rearranging their night around a complication that had just arrived uninvited. She had already known, Vorath realized, before the test results, before the attending physician confirmed it 40 minutes later. She had known from the 11-second window, from the pulse, from the particular quality of the man's apologetic hedging, and she had been moving around that knowledge ever since. He recorded the observation carefully. Humans developed predictive pattern recognition through accumulated trauma exposure. This was documented. But watching it in real time, watching a mind work that fast and that quietly, produced in Vorath an intellectual disquiet he hadn't anticipated. His 4 secondary hearts adjusted their rhythm in response, a biological stress indicator, though the stress in this case was closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of something large. At 11:52 p.m., the department received a trauma call. This was where Vorath's theoretical understanding of human emergency medicine began to fail him in useful ways. The patient arrived by ground vehicle. Humans still used ground vehicles for medical transport, a fact that never stopped striking Vorath as functionally medieval. And the team that received her moved in a formation that had no official name in any manual he had read, but which operated with the precision of a formation he recognized from military contexts. Every person in that room understood their position. Every hand knew what it was reaching for before it reached. There was very little verbal communication, and what existed was clipped, exact, almost encrypted in its efficiency. The patient was a young female human, catastrophic blood loss from a vehicle collision. Her blood pressure was generating numbers on the monitors that Vorath's medical training told him were incompatible with sustained consciousness. And yet she was conscious, and she was talking, which, when he processed it fully, he found profoundly unnerving. She was asking about her dog. She wanted to know if someone had called about her dog. One of the nurses told her the dog was fine. The dog was being taken care of, which Vorath was reasonably certain was not information anyone currently possessed. And the young woman's body visibly settled at this, her metabolic distress measurably decreasing, which meant the lie, if it was a lie, was functioning as a clinical intervention. He flagged this in his notes with 3 separate markers. He would think about it for a long time. Della was not the lead on this trauma, but she was present, working a station near the patient's left side, with the contained focus of someone doing a thing they have done so many times it lives in the muscle rather than the mind. There was a moment, Vorath almost missed it, where the attending physician asked for something, used the wrong word for it, a terminology mismatch that might have cost 30 seconds of confusion, and Della simply handed him the correct item without comment, without correction, without any visible indication that she had performed a translation. The physician did not acknowledge it. She did not expect him to. Vorath noted, "This is not subservience. This is something else." He did not yet have the word for it. By 1:15 a.m., 3 new patients had arrived. One of the monitoring bays was showing an equipment fault that the biomedical technician had been called about twice with no response, and the waiting room had developed a specific quality of tension that Vorath, who had studied conflict de-escalation in 17 species contexts, recognized as pre-incident. A man near the back wall was not sitting the way the other waiting humans were sitting. He was holding himself differently. Vorath's threat assessment instincts, rarely called upon in his work as a biological observer, began producing low-level signals. He was still watching the man when Della walked past him, out of the main department and directly into the waiting room, and sat down beside a woman near the front who was crying silently in the particular way that suggested she had been doing it for a long time and had grown tired of it. Vorath checked his task log. There was nothing in Della's immediate medical queue that required her to be in that waiting room. She had no clinical reason to be sitting beside that woman. He watched her talk. He could not hear what was said. He watched the crying woman's body language shift. A slow, incremental change, the hunching loosening, the hands unclenching. After perhaps 4 minutes, Della stood, said something that made the woman almost laugh. Not quite, but the architecture of a laugh, the face preparing for it, and walked back into the department. As she passed the man in the back wall, she glanced at him. Just once. He looked back. Something passed between them in that look. Some human signal Vorath could not decode, and the man's posture changed. The pre-incident quality in the room decreased. Vorath stood very still for a moment after she disappeared back through the department doors. His chromatophore layer, the bioluminescent tissue beneath his outer skin that responded to emotional states, was producing a low, involuntary blue-gold pulse. He was not aware of it until a child in the waiting room pointed at him and said something to its parent, and the parent shushed it, and Vorath pulled his coat closed and returned to his observation post, with his notes slightly less organized than he preferred. 2:30 a.m. Introduced with the staff called, with the particular dry affection of humans for catastrophe, the stretch. A cluster of vehicle collisions on a nearby transit corridor. Humans and their vehicle collisions, Vorath thought, not for the first time, generated 7 admissions in 40 minutes. The department, which had been full before, was now exceeding capacity in a way that produced genuine logistical problems. There were not enough bays. There was not enough staff. The charge nurse, not Della, a larger male human named Brennan who had the energy of someone running on insufficient sleep and excessive conviction, was on the phone with hospital administration producing numbers in a voice that had gone dangerously quiet. Vorath noticed that when human professionals became very dangerous, they frequently became very quiet. This was the opposite of most species he had observed. The keth became louder. The myriad flashed warning coloration. Humans went still and soft-voiced and started making decisions. Della, during the stretch, did not stop moving for 47 minutes. Vorath tracked her across his observation field, watching her triage system. She was operating, he realized, with a personal mental map of the department that ran parallel to and occasionally ahead of the official medical management system. She knew which attending was fastest on which type of case. She knew which bay had the faultiest equipment. She knew which patients were deteriorating faster than their current classification suggested, and she repositioned resources around that knowledge without ever being asked to, without ever formally requesting authority to, in a continuous, quiet process of intervention that left no official record and required no acknowledgement. At 3:10 a.m., a patient in Bay 6 coded. Vorath had observed death before. He was a biologist and an observer. Mortality was a feature of the universe he had long ago categorized and filed. But there was something about the way a human medical team responded to the cessation of cardiac function that he found, each time he witnessed it, genuinely startling. The speed of it, the absolute refusal to accept the data. In Keth medicine, when the indicators reached a certain threshold, there were protocols for recognizing the inevitable. There was a philosophical framework around the moment. There was a quality of acceptance. The team in Bay 6 had no such framework, or if they did, they had buried it somewhere unreachable during working hours. Della ran the compression rotation. This was physically demanding work, rhythmic, forceful, sustained, and Vorath watched her cycle through it with a methodical intensity that had nothing transcendent about it. It was not heroic. It was not beautiful. It was a human refusing, with her entire body weight, to cooperate with a biological event. She was sweating. Her jaw was tight. The patient's monitor was producing sounds that Vorath's medical training told him were not improving sounds. 14 minutes, the attending called it. Della stepped back. She stood at the edge of the bay for approximately 8 seconds, her breathing calibrating back to baseline. Vorath watched her face during those 8 seconds and understood, in a way he had not previously, why human emotional suppression had been so difficult for Keth psychologists to accurately model. It was not that she was not feeling it. It was that she had developed, over 13 years of this, a series of internal chambers, the way some species developed pressure-resistant compartments in their deep-sea biology, and she was moving the feeling into one of those chambers now, sealing it with a precision that was almost surgical. Because the department still had 42 other patients, and 7 of them needed her attention in the next 10 minutes. She turned and walked out of the bay and went to the next patient. Vorath's olfactory organs were producing a stress response he had not experienced before. A sharp, involuntary constriction at the back of his secondary passages. The Keth equivalent of what he believed humans called a lump in the throat. He made a note of it. Then he made a note of the note, because he wanted to remember that he had been affected and to examine later whether that was appropriate for an objective observer. He decided, quietly, that he did not care whether it was appropriate. At 4 a.m., the department entered a brief, relative stillness. This was not quiet. The monitors continued. The waiting room continued. A physician down the hall was having an argument with someone on the phone about an insurance authorization that Vorath found baffling in ways that were specifically disturbing. But the acute crisis level dropped, and the staff entered the particular human state of post-surge endurance. They were tired. Vorath could observe it biochemically, the micro-expressions of fatigue, the marginally slower reaction times, the way several of the nurses moved to the small room near the supply station and consumed substances that Vorath's briefing materials identified as caffeinated beverages, and, in one case, something wrapped in foil that appeared to be a sandwich, eaten with the concentrated gratitude of someone for whom food had temporarily become a spiritual experience. Della ate half an energy bar, standing at the nursing station while charting. She did not sit down. She had not sat down, Vorath calculated, for 4 hours and 53 minutes. He also noticed, and he wasn't sure why he was noticing this, except that he had been trained to notice everything, that 3 times in the past hour, other nurses had approached her for something. Not the attendings, not the charge nurse, the junior staff. They came to her with questions that they perhaps could have taken elsewhere, and she answered them without fanfare, without any visible performance of authority, and they left with what they needed. She was functioning, Vorath realized, as a kind of informal load-bearing structure in the department. Not the highest rank, not the most visible. But if you removed her, he thought, something would stop working in a way that wouldn't immediately show up on any organizational chart. He added a section to his report and labeled it Non-Hierarchical Competency Distribution. He suspected this was going to be one of the more important sections. At 4:45 a.m., a man was brought in who was very loud about not being injured. He was injured. He was also intoxicated by one or more substances and operating on a combative setting that made the initial intake process significantly more complex than it needed to be. He had opinions about the hospital, about the wait times, about the cost of medical care in his country, which, Vorath had to concede, appeared to be a legitimate grievance based on numbers he had reviewed. And he expressed these opinions at a volume and with a specificity that drew attention from the entire waiting area. Vorath watched with genuine curiosity as Della handled him. She did not match his energy. She did not attempt to outvolume him or assert authority over him or call for a security intervention, though one would have been justified. Instead, she positioned herself at a very specific angle to him that Vorath, after a moment's analysis, recognized as non-threatening in the particular way that certain predatory species learn to approach skittish prey. Not head-on, not crowded, slightly oblique. She spoke at a normal conversational volume that required him to quiet himself slightly to hear her. She asked him one question about his pain that was specific enough to be surprising, and he stopped mid-complaint to answer it. And in the space of answering it, he became, fractionally, less of a situation and more of a patient. It took perhaps 6 minutes total. Vorath had seen Keth conflict mediators use structurally identical techniques. He had seen them trained and drilled and evaluated over months. He had watched them fail half the time in controlled conditions. Della had done it at 4:45 in the morning, tired, after losing a patient 2 hours earlier, on instinct, while simultaneously being aware that she had 4 other patients who needed things. The lump in the throat response was back. Vorath's sensory tendrils, thin filaments at his jawline usually tucked flat, emerging only under significant overstimulation, had extended by approximately 2 millimeters. He pressed them back and adjusted his collar. At 5:50 a.m., the sky outside the hospital's narrow windows began to change color. Vorath had observed human dawn before, but there was something about watching it arrive through the small, practical windows of a trauma department that was different from watching it as an aesthetic phenomenon. In here, the light changing outside the window meant the shift was nearly over. It meant people had survived the night. It meant the calculus of the past several hours, how many had come in, how many had been stabilized, how many had not, was almost complete. A 7 a.m. shift was incoming. The department would not actually become less busy, but it would become someone else's busy, and the people who had carried it through the dark hours could put it down. At 6:20 a.m., Della sat down for the first time since 11:15 p.m. She sat in the charting area, and she did not immediately look at her screen. She looked at the middle distance for perhaps 30 seconds. Vorath did not observe or record during those 30 seconds. He looked away deliberately because something about that moment felt like it did not belong in a report. It was not data. Or it was, but it was the kind of data that lost something irreplaceable in the encoding. He had been studying the biology of human resilience for 3 standard years. He had read the literature, the neurological studies, the psychological frameworks, the evolutionary hypotheses. He understood academically what humans were capable of sustaining. But the understanding of a thing and the witnessing of it were, he was discovering, not at all the same experience. She began charting at 6:23 a.m. Her documentation was precise, thorough, and completed faster than Vorath's models had predicted based on observed fatigue levels. He recalibrated his fatigue models. At 6:47 a.m., the young woman from the earlier trauma, the one who had asked about her dog, was moved to a general ward. She was stable. She would, the prognosis indicated, recover. Della was in the hallway when they wheeled her past, and she said something brief and quiet to the young woman, and the young woman reached out and briefly clasped her hand. And Della nodded once, the way someone nods when a calculation has come out right. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not the kind of moment that ended stories in the way stories usually wanted to end. It was small and plain and unremarkable in the way that the most significant things very often were. At 7:03 a.m., the incoming shift arrived and the handoff process began. Della briefed the oncoming nurse with the same efficiency she had applied to everything else. Clean, ordered, stripped of everything unnecessary, comprehensive in all the ways that mattered. She handed over her patients like she was entrusting something important to someone she had decided to trust, which, Vorath supposed, was exactly what she was doing. At 7:22 a.m., she retrieved a bag from a locker room and walked out of the emergency department. Vorath followed her to the lobby, which was as far as his observer access permitted, and stood watching through the glass doors as she walked into the morning. She did not look back. She moved through the early light with the unhurried but purposeful gait of someone who has finished a thing that needed finishing and intends now to rest, and then to come back and do it again. He stood there for longer than was professionally necessary. His report, when he finally compiled it, ran to 47 pages. The council had requested 8. They received 47, and Vorath included a note at the front explaining that he had been unable to reduce it further without losing something he believed was essential. He included the non-hierarchical competency distribution section. He included his recalibrated fatigue models. He included a subsection on informal emotional support delivery as concurrent crisis management. He included the analysis of the lie about the dog. He included a note, formally marked as subjective observation because he was a scientist and he honored the distinction, that watching a single human being sustain functional compassion across a 12-hour mass casualty event had altered, in some small but permanent way, his understanding of what a category classification was even supposed to measure. He did not include the 30 seconds when Della looked at the middle distance and he looked away. Some data, he had decided, was not for the report. The council reviewed his work. They debated for 6 weeks. They upgraded humanity's designation to Category 2, citing, among other factors, evidence of what they termed adaptive systemic resilience at the individual level. Vorath thought that was not quite the right phrase. He had spent some time trying to find the right phrase. The closest he could get, translated from the Keth and carrying the inevitable losses of any translation, was something like, "They show up. When it is hard and dark and the outcome is uncertain, and the shift has been going for hours, and the night has asked everything they had, and then come back for more. They show up. For each other, for the stranger who is asking about their dog, for the patient in the room that will not be a victory tonight. They show up, and they do not stop, and they do not explain it, and they seem, on some fundamental level, to find this ordinary." He had spent 3 years studying humanity. He thought, after the night shift, that he was only beginning to understand what he was looking at. He applied for a second observation assignment. He was granted one. He went back to the same hospital. He requested, specifically, the night shift. He did not request a different nurse to observe.